My name's Anya and I'm supported by our secretary, Paul Daly, today, and he's looking after the tech stuff and supervising the chat as well. So we've got two fantastic speakers this afternoon. We'll be hearing from both of them and then we're going to be asking them some questions, and then I'll open up to the room to widen debate. Then there's going to be a short break when we return for the business of the branch, so anyone is welcome to join us for that. I also need to let you know that this session is being recorded, so I will now invite you all to turn your mics off, please. Okay, so our first speaker, Melissa Benn, welcome and thank you for joining us. You are one of the vice presidents of the SEA, writer, journalist, author and education campaigner, and you advocate for greater equality in education, and actually you've won awards for that. Melissa, it is so lovely to have you here in our virtual world. You have become my digital pen pal almost, and our dear friend Nigel Todd, who founded this branch, actually put us in contact when he suggested you might like to look at some works and writing that I was working on, and we've stayed in touch since. So he would be so delighted that you are here today to talk to us about the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, something that he was so passionate about, and actually amplifying the drive on adult education, on lifelong learning, is one way in which we can support his legacy. So Melissa, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. That was a really lovely introduction. It's often quite strange to have people tell you about yourself, but that was very, very nicely done. And so I want to do a number of things today. I'm going to talk about the key principles of the Centenary Commission for Adult Education, which I sat on, and which do, as I think, Anya, you suggested, hint at a broader movement that actually goes back a long way for what we need to do. But I'm also very aware of, I was interested to see that Julia's speaking, and I see us as two sides of an important movement, particularly now when I think after 10 years of a Conservative government, and I mean, we can't just do it in electoral parcels, because some of this goes back to New Labour and some of it goes back to Thatcherism, but there's been this incredible emphasis on the school years as what education is for, and also an emphasis on social mobility and a narrowing of the curriculum and a narrowing of the school experience. And I think Julia and I are both going to talk about either ends of the educational experience, what they call from cradle to grave. And the more I think about education, and I've done my share of obsessing about the school years, the more I think we have to widen out the discussion. And it's so vital what happens in the early years, but I'll let Julia do that. But when you think about it, so half of students leave at, you now have
I remember
the school leaving age of 18, and half of our young people go to university of some kind, but that they stop at 21. So and we're all going to live to our mid-80s if we're sensible with our diet and don't drink and smoke too much. So anyway, that's to slightly anticipate what I'm going to say. I wanted to start by paying tribute to Nigel. I think I was trying to remember over the last week, where did I first meet Nigel? And I think I first met him when he invited me to speak at the centenary meeting in Newcastle Town Hall of the WEA. And I remember being really quite frightened. I mean, I was, a middle-aged woman, but as soon as I walked into that town hall, I felt that classic imposter thing. I thought, why am I here? There was Chi Onwurah, the MP, the Bishop of Newcastle, and I was speaking about education generally. But Nigel was so generous. He was such a generous individual, and he made me feel so welcome and was so kind about everything I said. So I met him there and I kept in touch with him, and I got to know his daughter Selina, who is now a very prominent historian. I've just reviewed her latest book for the New Statesman, and she's a prominent activist in the most polarized debate probably in the current situation. But in 2018, Nigel asked me to join the Centenary Commission on Adult Education. And I think it was typical of Nigel, although he was on the steering group that set up the commission, he didn't take a place on it himself. He was sort of in the background. but again, with that warmth and support, and he was just very, very considerate. And again, this week, I was just reading a chapter he sent me looking at the 1919 Commission and the post-First World War period, which was what framed the commission I sat on. But Nigel wrote a very, very interesting, he was a historian, Selina and he are both historians, looking at how after the First World War, there began to be groups of various kinds of WEA, Nottingham University, the first university to have extramural classes and so on. So he was charting that history and how that laid the basis for what is a very rich adult education tradition in this country. So Nigel absolutely represented the spirit, the substance of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to first of all say, why does adult education matter? And then I'm just going to talk about one key fact or set of facts that I think we all need to understand, and 3 key principles, and then I'll stop. So why does it matter? It goes back to what I was saying before. It matters because education doesn't stop in your late teens. In fact, if I look at my own experience, I had probably a sort of classic, ordinary education. I did my O-levels and my A-levels, and then I had a year off, and then I went to university. And I remember coming out of university and thinking, I know now how little I know. And I went straight into a WEA class taught by Sheila Rowbottom, the feminist, about tensions between socialism and feminism around women getting the vote. And actually, I think it also was extended beyond that. And I just felt this quite legitimate humility that has grown and grown, and legitimate ignorance, sense of my own ignorance. But what's interesting about that is it is often those who are educated who go on to do for adult education. And the very people who need it are those who school, and let's face it, our school system has by and large, it's built into it a sense of success or failure. It used to be the grammar secondary modern divide. Now it's a system that is riven with testing and exams. And a third of our students leave technically having failed their education. Half of young people leave primary school told they're not secondary ready. 9 million adults in 2019, and I don't know what the figures will be post-pandemic, 9 million adults struggle with literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. So we need a system that takes people, that helps those who didn't get an education to start to get an education, to learn, to maybe learn to love learning. Because the more I think about education, again, it's a very obvious point, it should be about teaching us all to love learning, because once you love learning, that's a process that never stops. And that's different from coming out, as many successful people do, with all their batch of, A-levels and GCSEs and all the rest of it, but they didn't enjoy it. So I think enjoyment is a really important part, or feeling that your education has meaning. So that's why it matters. And of course, the other side of it is that the economy is changing so fast. One study predicts that we will all have 8 different jobs or careers over our lifetime. Artificial intelligence, a new technology, we're in the middle of a new revolution, and therefore people have got to be able to keep up with that. So I was part of the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, which was started in 2019, sat for a year, and our aim was to look back to the 1919 Commission that as I said, Nigel wrote about, and to look at what had been achieved in those 100 years and to see what still needed doing. And we sat for a year, we travelled around the country, we went to see lots of projects. I'm going to briefly talk about a couple of them. We heard an enormous amount of evidence, and 3 principles I want to bring out. There were so many things. I do recommend you look at the Commission report. It's very nicely set out and very easy to navigate. And we have a website that's carried on the debate now. So the 3, the important fact, actually, another important fact to say is that we did have a rich tradition of adult education, particularly, I would say, it was rooted in 1919, but particularly from the Second World War through to the 1990s. The establishment of the Open University, WEA classes, extramural classes at universities, and local authorities, of which something like the Inner London Education Authority would be a very good example. At one point in the 1970s, I think it put on 20,000 classes a year. And I remember, again, as part of this feeling I had that I just need to learn. I know nothing about economics. I went to an economics class at my local school. I don't know the first principles of physics. I went to try and learn. I learned German. All of those things are really difficult to find now, because with cuts to local authorities, with the abolition of ILIA, they've dropped away. And then another shift, two shifts really sort of did for this broader idea of adult education, or the broader practice, fees in education. It all started to cost. Higher education, as we know, but also starting to charge fees for doing classes and further learning. And 50% of mature learners dropped out of doing a degree because they didn't want to take on a loan, which younger people do take on, maybe because they don't quite realise what it means. So that began to chip away at it. And then there was this shift, and I'm afraid it came around the middle of the Labour government, sort of 2005, 2006, where there's a famous quote from Alan Johnson, who was, I think, Minister for Education then, saying, we don't want people learning Pilates, we want people doing plumbing, we don't want people doing flower arranging, we want people doing, it was all geared to skills. And the thing is, that's very short-sighted actually, because probably Pilates teachers, yoga teachers, well-being teachers are a big part of the economy now. I mean, plumbing will always be an important part of the economy, but this very narrow idea. So the three principles of the Commission: first, that adult education goes beyond skills for jobs. And the government, Boris Johnson's government, has just, after a long delay, all their policies, there's a long delay. We're still waiting for social care. We waited a long time for their skills policy, and they've offered a lifetime skills qualification, and a number of problems with it. It's going to offer loans to people to do A-level equivalent courses. It's got quite a limited number of courses that you can get loans for, which gives the government's view of what is important and what isn't. And humanities subjects are not considered as important as other areas of the economy. And that's a feature of everything through from schools to university, the cutting back of arts courses and looking at everything from this very arid view of what does the economy supposedly need. And the other change is that FE is being remodelled, this is a summary, so that employers say what the needs of the local job market are, and the local FE colleges help provide it. And it's a very limited view. And it's not about learning for the sake of learning. It's not about learning from experience. It doesn't bring in self-help groups or voluntary groups. And that's what we need then. Adult education has to be about that. The state has a role in promoting it, and I'll come on to a bit about what that is, but we need to fund and support voluntary groups, civic associations, online forums, local authorities, to develop this broader idea of adult education. Second principle is something I felt very strongly about, is that you've got to start from where people are. And two projects brought that home to me. So I go back to that government proposal that they will give money to people who want to do an A-level in something they approve of. Lots of people are so far away from being able to do that. They may have problems writing, reading, they may have confidence problems. We know that those who have had difficulty accessing learning will not go very far to access it. So I went to visit a project in Rochdale called the Citizens Curriculum, and it was just such a fantastic project. It came out of a number of people in Rochdale Council who saw this shift during New Labour towards skills for jobs and everything being around the economy, saw it wasn't working for the people of Rochdale, and decided to do something that did work for the people of Rochdale. And what it meant was that they would go to people and they would say, what do you need? And so some of the men and women that I met, one man was homeless. So the first thing he needed was somewhere to live. So they helped him to get somewhere to live. One of the young women they helped was being abused and needed help to free herself from that situation. There were a group of people I met who were now very expert in coding, but they needed a room to work in. So it just began from there. And so it was almost like a coaxing through a group of experienced learners who work with the citizens who need this curriculum. It was coaxing people through the life stages in order to get the skills or do the learning that they needed to. And they had fantastic success. And it also saved public money, because they did an analysis which showed that the amount of money spent on emergency services was cut by a quarter because they were reaching people where they needed to. And the other example was the Union Learn project, which was set up in 1998, just after New Labour came in. It cost a paltry 12 million a year, and it reached 250,000 people every year. Either it was somebody working maybe as a clerical worker administering refuse collections, helping them with their digital skills. But one or two of those might then say, I really enjoyed that. I talked to people who said, I really enjoyed that. And they went on to do a St John's ambulance course, and then they might go on and do something else. So again, it was starting from where people were and encouraging them. And of course, for some people, it led to entirely new careers. I spoke to a young man who worked in a bank. He was obviously incredibly smart, and he ended up getting various degrees and postgraduate degrees and joining the Institute of Management. Spoke to a woman who was working as a teaching assistant in a school. She really wanted to become a teacher. She didn't have the confidence. Union Learn, which is all based in the workplace, helped her to become a teacher specialising in special needs. The government axed the scheme. It was axed in March. And I'm afraid that I wrote an article about it for The Guardian. They wouldn't, it didn't appear in print, let's put it this way. I have to be careful because we're being recorded. But I had heard from people that the Treasury was willing to support it, but that the Department of Education wasn't. And I think there may have been an element of the Department of Education being fed up with the trade unions during the pandemic, who did such a good job in leading and suggesting what should happen in schools. And I think there was a number of people said it was anti-union. It was just a straightforward anti-union thing. I mean, this is a Tory government. They want the employers to decide what's needed, and they don't want the unions to have a role. And the third thing, which is my final point, is we need a national strategy for adult learning, but locally delivered. And in the Commission, we proposed a Minister of Lifelong Learning, but it has to be delivered in partnership with local authorities, local groups, groups like the WEA, groups like the Cooperative College, and the newly devolved mayors. And we're putting on a public webinar, which I hope you'd all like to join, with some of the newly elected mayors, hoping Tracy Brabin will join us, Andy Burnham's coming to speak, Jules Pike, the Deputy Mayor of London, and going to talk about what the adult education strategy is under their mayoral control. But what I learned from sitting on the Commission is a bit what I've learned from life, that I live in an area that's very much, it's, you know, Brent in London, it's a borough, it's like every other area in the country. But one of the things that have been really important to me and all those around have been the GP surgery and the school. And those two places and the communities that are spread out from those two places, I mean, there are obviously many other landmarks, but they've been the key public service landmarks. And we need community learning centres. Sometimes they might be part of a local school, but they could be quite separate. Because going back to that point, and I'm going to end by reading something that Nigel wrote about this. but it's got to be it's got to be accessible to everyone, not just those who know how to navigate education, who are the ones benefiting from a lot of further learning now. And Alan Tuckett, the vice chair of our commission, was always talking about a city called Kuwon-si in South Korea, where no citizen is further than 10 minutes from a community learning centre, whether that's a library in a local hairdresser's or a room in a local cinema where people can meet and have a class or whatever. And I thought that was fantastic. And we need that in towns and our cities because physical spaces are important. So I'm going to end with something that Nigel said, which kind of pulls all these ideas together, which is when you're trying to reach adults from the left behind experience, that when you're trying to, I don't know, this isn't quite right, and it's from my own book, something's missing, a word, anyway. What the left behind experience teaches you is that they won't initially travel very far from home, 10 minutes walk if you're lucky. The WEA success story, and the same was true of the cooperative movement for much of its history, was built on being or going local rather than expecting people to go to a centre far away. If we're going to break down the left behind barriers, then adult education as a community dynamo has to have the capacity to work very locally. I think that sums up so much of what has worked in this country over the last 100 years and what needs to work again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. So our next speaker this afternoon is Julia Falconbridge. Welcome, Julia. Thank you for giving us your time this afternoon. Julia, you are a consultant clinical psychologist for children, young people and their families. And this is a bit of a mouthful, this bit, but you represented the British Psychological Society on the coalition government's task force on improving the wellbeing and mental health of children and young people, yes. And I think that might have been the work that came out of the Children's Plan 2013, which reported back in 2014. So you have also co-authored this book, and I apologise if I'm going to go a bit Graham Norton now, but I loved this book. This is all about improving the well-being of young people, but through the symbiosis of education, health and care. But I actually think that not only did I enjoy this, but I actually think that this is a really useful tool for professionals working with young people. I've actually ordered it into our college library because I think our health and care students level 3 and up will find it really useful when they're writing about multi-agency working, and our PGCE students as well. So Julia, welcome, and over to you on building resilience and wellness in our children and our young people. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I mean, I worked in the NHS for many years until I took retirement as a clinical psychologist, and I ran a community-based service for children, young people and families, which is where my clinical experience comes from, and an awful lot of the lessons I learned working with people and organisations in the community underpins, you know, the starting point of that book. I'm going to give you a very whistle-stop tour, and I hope that my screen sharing will enable me to do that. Are people able to see that okay? Good. So I've gone slightly wider than just resilience and young people, because I think, you know, we've just got to look at the systems that operate, you know, all the way through. So, you know, if my starting point, you know, what would it mean to have a model of child services that truly paid attention to helping the next generation grow up, to have greater psychological well-being and be more resilient, rather than just spending all our resources on trying to help after things have gone wrong? Sorry, why isn't that working? Oh, there we go. Wonders of technology. See if I can get my next slide now. Bear with me. I might have to call on my son. Can't find him. Sorry, bear with me. My technical assistant is coming. I can't get it to click down. What am I doing wrong? through. Yes, thank you. Isn't it useful? A member of the younger generation. Okay, so what we need to look at are risk factors, protective factors, and resilience, about how we can nurture well-being. And what I'm trying to do is to look at child mental health and well-being from the opposite perspective of what is often employed, rather than thinking about what do we do when kids have got problems. Think about what we can do as a society to raise children to be psychologically healthy and resilient, able to enjoy productive lives and manage the difficulties and challenges that will inevitably occur. Some of you may have come across this, Bronfenbenner's ecological approach to child development. It's, you know, it's such a foundation stone these days to the way we look at children and how they develop. Right in the middle of that set of circles is the child. Around them is their microsystem, the next circle, the exosystem, and then top of that, the macrosystem. And the microsystem, this is the bit directly around the child, is the institutions and groups that directly impact on them, like their family, their school, their peer groups, religious institutions, the neighbourhood in which they're growing up. The next circle outwards is the wider social factors, where the child and the family don't have a direct role, but these really influence their microsystems. So for example, the employment practices of the place where their parents are working will determine how much time those parents have to spend with their children. The benefits system will depend how much they are living in poverty. The mass and social media will be impacting on so many people's ways of thinking and seeing the world. And then the final ring, the macro system, is the wider society and the culture within which the child lives. And obviously this is the political system. Within here you see the impact of ethnicity within a sort of the culture that the child is living in, their sense of cultural identity, all of those big society issues. And people, when they focus on child development, they often focus on the microsystem, because it's seen as having the strongest influence on a child's development, with decreasing influence as you go out through the rings. So obviously the parents and the school are really important, but this way of looking at it fails to recognise that every part of the child's ecological system are influenced by those outermost rings. It's the society and the political culture in which they live that impacts downwards. Proximal factors like family and friends are close and we can see them. We know that what the influence of these things are on us. But social and economic factors are what we call distal factors. They act on us through others, and their influence is actually often hidden. And this is a real issue in many areas of mental health. People don't realise where the pressures that are operating on them actually come from. We can say good parenting or good schooling is a positive influence on a child, but what actually enables a parent or a school to be good for their children with them? Risk factors is an area of real importance where there's been a lot of research. World Health Organization grouped these into 3 areas: the environmental factors like injustice, discrimination, exposure to trauma; social factors like loneliness, bereavement, and neglect; and then individual factors like, you know, for children who maybe have cognitive difficulties or emotionally immature, and really importantly, the children who've got physical health problems and other sorts of disabilities, really sort of key risk factors. You may have heard of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I mean, this is a real, you know, it's one of these buzz terms. Again, it's the things that happen to a child that are not the sort of things you would want a child to experience. Some of them really severe, like, you know, child sexual abuse, poverty, drug use within the family, etc. There's loads of them. And unfortunately, you now get some people, particularly in schools, who are trying to give children ACE scores. You know, you tot up the number of these things that have happened to them and you give them a score. It's just such a wrong understanding of the way we should be looking at risk factors. And then we've got protective factors. Now, these are actually defined as the things that improve the outcomes for children who are already at significant disadvantage. And this work came from Rutter, a key figure in this area, who they're saying, well, you know, if you take some kids, even in the worst, most adverse circumstances, they actually seem to come through. How? And some of the things are positive school experiences. Having a good relationship with at least one adult is absolutely key. There are other ones that are more specific. So if you look at sort of children growing up in a family with severe parental depression, there's other things about the amount of social support available to that family and the climate within the family that seem to protect the children from the worst impacts. And then the final one, what I call rubbish words, these assets or promotive factors. These are the things that are associated with better outcomes at all levels of risk or none. Important to recognise they're not just the opposite of risk factors, but some of the key ones are good family relationships, secure attachment to your parents, good student-teacher relationships in a school, opportunities for social life. And this bottom one, which I think, you know, really speaks to what Melissa was talking about, the opportunities to find out what you're good at, which these days is so often not going to be what is on the school curriculum for so many young people. So resilience, what I was actually asked to talk about in the first place, but I don't think you can do it without the sort of this wider picture. It's much debated, and actually it's incredibly often misrepresented as some sort of internal characteristic. Another of these things I hate, people who talk about grit, the idea that schools should be inculcating grit into children. It's terrible. It's not about the preserve of, you know, these incredibly resilient people. We've got all these resources, but actually it's very ordinary. This is Anne Maston, who wrote a book called Ordinary Magic. It's a, quote her, a healthy human brain in good working order, close relationships with competent caring adults, committed families, effective schools and communities, opportunities to succeed, and beliefs in the self nurtured by positive interactions with the world. So resilience, you can see from that, it is not an individual attribute. It's not something that sits inside you. We need to consider not just resilient people, but resilient places, resilient communities. And when you look at it like that, it leads to policy interventions that can help build resilience across all of those, strengthening social relationships, opportunities for community connection, adult education being one, building and enabling social support, social networks, social capital. And Rutter, again, to quote him, describes how all the longitudinal studies that have been done of children developing shows resilience is actually a dynamic process, can only be understood in terms of the individual and their environment, and as a fluid interaction between the two over time. So a vision for the future. This can alter the perspective we take around child mental health. Instead of asking how we help children with problems overcome them, first, we ask how we can support communities and families to bring up the next generation, minimising risk factors, promoting positive psychological development, and then you start to get new answers. There's a really well-known, well, probably not well-known, it's well-known to me, analogy for all our health services that are under pressure, which all of them are, that we need to stop mopping and turn down the taps. Health systems under pressure due to high demand are like constantly overflowing sinks. Ill health is water cascading out of the full sink onto the floor. All our energy and resources go into trying to mop the floor more effectively, but the water keeps pouring in because we haven't turned off the taps. The emphasis has been on strategies to improve our mopping, become more efficient, more effective, more therapy. Well, while that's valuable, it doesn't change the rate of flow of difficulties. And it's a flow, we have to remember, represents high levels of distress and suffering and long-term consequences for children and for our society. And there's a trainee clinical psychologist who's done this graphic on this, which sums up so much of what I want to say. You know, as if you look, the taps there, the systems and policies, and of course government leaders, the hands on the policy. The water, I don't know if you can read all this, you know, it's the austerity cuts, trauma, poverty, racism, all these things that are sort of pouring out, hitting the floor. And that's where we see the anxiety, violence, addiction, self-harm, eating disorders. And then around at the bottom, we've got the bucket of mental health services and also social workers doing some sponging up and educational school staff trying to sort of dry things with a towel. And I'm not quite sure what the criminal justice system would be trying to do in there, but I really like that illustration that she did. So what I want to argue is that actually we ought to be investing in our children. And there's lots of roles here for national and local government. We know the major risk factors are things like poverty, social inequality, housing, employment practices and discrimination. And they need sustained government action. And this isn't happening obviously at the moment. Maybe in some future we have a Labour government, it will be. But you know, the housing crisis, the children are not in unsafe, unsanitary conditions, in insecure tenancies, making neighbourhoods places they can play and spend time in, having more children's centres. And this one's really important, I think, enabling schools to develop a wide range of creative, sporting and non-academic activities with and for the children and the local community. And we need to build better systems. Instead of trying to do everything on an individual basis, we need a whole system approach so that psychological health is woven into every part of children's lives and builds from the community upwards. And you know, there are models for this, a reference there to some work I did. The key features of these integrated systems to make all places where children and young people and families go psychologically informed, culturally appropriate, culturally competent, and working with families in a compassionate relationship, not blaming them for the things they haven't done right. And then we also need a focus on those most in need by early identification, early input that gets drawing on child and family strength and resources, making sure all the agencies work together. I mean, it's not rocket science. But really importantly as well, actively involving young people and families in the design of services, for their own care and for the benefit of those in future. So this vision is calling for this wider perspective on how we understand well-being and a new understanding of what we should be doing that goes way beyond the individual to the family, community and society. And it actually feels like sometimes it's a pipe dream, but it can be achieved. And the Welsh Government are way ahead on this. They have just produced now a planning tool for the regional partnership boards. I'm not sure how you say it in the Welsh, NEST is the English equivalent. The whole system approach for developing mental health, wellbeing support services from the babies all the way up through families. It's all been built up through co-production with children, young people and families, and the resources they've produced are available to everybody. For some reason, this PowerPoint wouldn't do this as a circle, it's an oval. Again, you've got one of these ecological sort of maps here. So the nest is round the blue, nurturing, empowering, safe and trusted. The next ring in, you know, it's the people who are able to do the things, parents, carers, children, young people, health, social care, third sector education. And then, you know, what trying to do, be trusted, safe, supportive communities, etc. And now this is where I'm going to try and do a 3-minute animation for you. I'm sure I'm running over time, but if you bear with me. Oh no, where's it gone? There we are. Okay.
their ideas. It was agreed that nests were a good way of explaining what helps children of all ages to grow strong, aim high, and be the best they can be. This happens when their everyday relationships feel nurturing, empowering, safe, and trusted. Everyone's nest is unique, made up of the people who are closest to them, the things they enjoy and help them grow, their communities, and the places they go to in their day-to-day lives. Trusted adults play a vital part in a young person's nest. They can lift them when they are sad, encourage them to try new things, help them join in with others and make them feel valued and cared for. This is the everyday magic that builds and maintains positive mental health and well-being. The NEST framework aims to organise services so that more people get to experience this everyday magic in their daily lives. It also aims to help children and young people feel a sense of belonging, which is so important to mental health and well-being, whether that is at home, in school, at a club, with friends, or in their community. And when things aren't going well, like when a child or a young person is feeling sad, anxious, left out, or so angry that they push people away, the trusted adults who know them best will have access to support, giving them lots of ideas to try and the confidence to keep helping. That's because sometimes what a young person needs most is for trusted adults not to give up. NEST recognises how important trusted adults are. When they are well supported, it can make all the difference. Sometimes, of course, extra help is needed, and the NEST framework's no wrong door approach recognises that everyone is different and there should be lots of different types of help available. That way, all services come together to work out who can best meet the unique needs of each person. This makes sure children and families aren't bounced around services and gives access to the right help at the right time in the right way for them. We all need different kinds of help at different times along the way. The NEST framework aims to support children of all ages, parents, carers, their wider families, and the professionals who help them. It's about making sure everyone has opportunities that are nurturing, empowering, safe, and trusted. Learn more about NEST today.
So, as Anya said, that was a whistle-stop tour about some of the things that are in this book, with lots of examples written by people who are actually doing these sorts of things. I've done you a quick reference list, the things in Wales, all the resources they have there, some things from, the Organised British Psychological Society. Liz Gregory, who was very instrumental in developing the work in Wales, writes a fantastic blog, We Need to Talk About Children's Mental Health, which I'd really recommend. And then The Ordinary Magic, if you want to look more into the sort of resilience in development with Anne Maston. And that's me, if you want to get in touch with me. So that's it.
Thank you, Julia, for that comprehensive presentation. I'd really like to ask you a question on literacy. So I think that there might be, and I want to see whether you do, that there might be a direct correlation between literacy and emotional literacy, which is a key to well-being and to living well. So over the last decade, literacy rates have decreased against a congruence of increased deprivation, cuts to education benefits and community services, which you've just mentioned, as well as increased overcrowding, lack of homes, rising unemployment, and of course, hunger. In 2011, so 10 years ago, UCU research, that's my trade union, found that 1 in 9 adults, that's 11% of adults, 10 years ago had no qualifications. That limited them to the jobs that they could go for and blocked them from progressing in education. And actually, statistically, they're more likely to be in prison, actually. That summer 2011, our former General Secretary, Sally Hunt, was on every news outlet talking about this. She was Liza Lu. She was Thomas Hardy's harbinger of doom, warning against the Tory D'Urbervilles and blotting of future landscapes. And she was right, and things got worse. And more recently, the Literacy Trust found that 16.5% of adults have very poor literacy. So a slightly different measure, but people with very poor literacy don't have qualifications, not qualifications to get into employment and level 3 qualifications. So literacy is more than reading, writing, speaking, listening. And if we think about basic comprehension that starts in primary schools, literacy is also about how we interpret, how we determine, how we ask questions, and how we formulate responses. And I think that it might be those same skills that are involved in responding to situations and circumstances, to overcoming obstacles in our ordinary and everyday lives. As such, then, literacy skills become transferable skills that help inform and shape our education, our career pathways, our emotional lives, and our political lives. And by political, I mean engaging in community processes, but also, our own decision making. So this becomes about agency, actually. And without agency, people are less able to better their lives, and they're less likely to be in control of their own lives, and that will affect their well-being. So we then have families and communities on a downward spiral, a downward trajectory. So is there agency and well-being? And if so, what is it that we can do? How do we begin to turn the tide on that?
Thank you, Anya. I mean, the sound went a bit dodgy on some of it. So I hope I caught all of what you were saying. I mean, I agree. I mean, literacy in our society is absolute foundation stone of everything, that, is happening for children and through on into adulthood. I think one of the things, I've worked quite a lot in schools. I mean, I'm not an educational psychologist, which not necessarily means much to everybody, but I've worked a lot supporting teachers within schools and providing sort of consultation support, really, where we talk about, some of the kids and what's happening and how to help them. One of the things that really strikes me when I've been doing some of that work is actually we are not doing what we need to do to work out why it is that some children struggle. People know about dyslexia, but there's so many other reasons why children actually are struggling. And that needs a very sort of, proper assessment to know what sort of input that they need. So I think we're failing very often. We're not, the junior schools, such like primaries, they're not acting quickly enough when children are sort of starting to struggle. By the time they actually act, that child is probably already seeing themselves as a failure, seeing this as something that they're not any good at, right, really early on. We're not assessing properly to work out why the problems are there, and therefore they're not getting the proper remedial action. And then on it goes. For every year that goes by, the harder it is to actually catch up. And you're not just missing out then on your reading and your English, you're missing out on every subject, and I've come across so many kids, where this is an absolute sort of, key issue in their whole sense of themselves. And actually, the other thing is, if you can't read, there are things you can watch on television that show you what the world can be like in a different way to your own. But by and large, watching things doesn't give you access to the inner world of people. You read a book, you read a novel, you get that sense of what it might be like, that there are other ways of being, other ways of thinking, other sorts of feelings, other types of relationships. And if you haven't got that, again, the world is closed in around you. So it's not just, the economic impact is huge. The social impact is huge. But the whole sort of thing of how you understand the world and what options you feel that are available to you are huge. So, yeah, I mean, it's far more than just, can you do the technical reading, isn't it? I'm sure we all come across children who can technically read, but actually they don't comprehend what they're reading, you know, because that aspect of their literacy has never been assessed properly either.
And the adults that they become. Because
Sorry?
they don't, and the adults that they become, because they don't stay children.
No, of course, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, we all know how powerful those early learning experiences are in shaping children's sense of who they are and what they're capable of. I mean, I don't have the data in front of me, but, you know, the shocking extent to which children growing up in poverty and difficult circumstances are so far behind, even by the time they're sort of, you know, 5 or 6 years old. We shouldn't be having to play catch up like this for them. You know, it should be so fundamental to the way that we sort of help them to develop. So exactly that, they then can become the adults that they can become.
And on that note, I'd like to bring Melissa back in. Melissa, I'd like to ask you about SEND, Special Educational Needs Provision. So you've written about education funds being directed towards an Oxbridge intelligence, channeled to narrow attainment for a singular type, that pluralism isn't recognised or supported. You recently wrote an article putting the special back into special needs. It's available on your website, but just that title made me think, putting the special back into special needs. And it reminded me that children, young people with special needs, and the adults that they become, well, they are to be treasured and they are precious too. And yet we are failing them. The symbiotic approach of education, health and care for special needs isn't working. The system cannot cope. And feeding back on the draft code of practice for SEND in 2013, which became the Act of 2014, it was clear 8 years ago that budgets and systems were not put in place to manage this symbiosis. In 2018-2019, Ofsted and the CQC carried out joint inspections right across the North East. Newcastle, South Tyneside, North Tyneside, County Durham, all told to improve. Northumberland failed the inspections spectacularly and with a £350,000 or thereabouts underspend. And the report that came out for Northumberland stressed that professionals from midwives to teachers to SENCOs, special educational needs coordinators in schools, were skilled in their roles. They were doing a good job, but they were facing workloads that were beyond anything that was manageable. So chronic underfunding and chronic understaffing is failing our special children. So Melissa, is funding and staffing enough to bring positive change? And how do we create opportunities and pathways and options for our special children to live well? You're muted, you need to unmute.
Am I unmuted now? Yeah.
Yeah.
I love your questions because they're so well informed and they kind of contain within them all the information we need to answer them. I mean, what I would do is say funding and staffing, what I would say is funding and staffing are crucial. But to go back to the earlier point, it isn't just special children with special needs. The whole system is geared towards one kind of achievement and one kind of child. And I don't want to sound Machiavellian about Michael Gove, but I actually think the reform of our school system, the reform of the curriculum, the reform of exams, and with that the academisation and free schools and the whole thing that went with it, was a way of saying to the middle class within state education, you too can have a private stroke grammar school type education. And there are quite a lot of parents within the system who have resources, who are educated, who did. I think there's even they like the changes. I think it's left an enormous number of children behind deliberately. But I think the problem is we're just looking at the child and the child's development and the child's place in society completely wrongly. Education is now about delivery. There are facts, all the best that's been thought and said, which in itself is a contentious idea, and it is to be delivered on high. And I just did a debate with a parent and the head of the NEU, Mary Boosted, and a teacher in Norwich about what we've learned from the pandemic. And the parent, who was homeschooling, said, I am horrified by the primary school curriculum. She said, my children are learning completely inappropriate things for their age, and not inappropriate as in, sort of morally inappropriate. She's learning about things like fronted adverbials. And I write for a living. I've written 9 books. I could not tell you what a fronted adverbial is. You don't need to know that. And anyway, even if you know what a fronted adverbial is, that's nothing to do with beginning to tell stories. Julia talked about stories are an access to inner worlds, and it's an access to your own inner world. It's a way of understanding other people's. Learning the parts of grammar is not the way to learn how to communicate. So there's just so many things that are wrong. The curriculum is stuffed full of stuff that not only is not necessarily, it controls teachers, it defeats most children, and I think it even fails the ones who are a success. I think it's a system built on obedience, not on exploration of the human. And so when we, just to answer to begin to raise the question, and then I'll stop, that Julia raised about, I think she used the word pipe dream. I think sadly, we are so far away from the kind of educational system we probably need to have. I think we probably got nearer to it in the Every Child Matters agenda of the Brown era, and extended schools and schools with those doors in that animation with different services on site that could help a child that needed learning, and that would include special educational needs. That's disappeared. That went with the cuts largely. Austerity has been damaging, but it's really the attitude behind it all that's been damaging. But I'm very aware that there are hands up of other people who, so I'm going to stop there. But does that answer what you asked me? Anyway.
I think so. I don't know if either of you or anyone in the room actually has seen the report that came out from Ofsted this week, because I don't think we can talk about improving wellbeing and building resilience in young people without referring to it. On Thursday, Ofsted published its review of sexual abuse in schools and colleges. The findings are horrific and upsetting. Not surprising to many of us working on the front line or to parents of teenagers, but unsurprising to a lot of people, unfortunately. For people unaware, this is about the prevalence of harmful sexual activity from adults to children, but also from peer group to peer group, pressurized activity, online abuse, sexualized verbal abuse, etc. in schools and colleges. So I was thinking about your approach, Julia, the whole society approach, and that we need to look at the whole school, the whole college approach to this. So schools and colleges, they're communities. They're not just teachers and students, and I feel quite strongly about this, but they're catering staff, they're security staff, administration staff, cleaning staff. We're a whole community together, and trade unions too, the organisations that represent and further interest in this community, centred around education and learning. And the key here for me is learning, and I think that the trade unions should drive on this, on reflecting and learning from case studies and experiences to make step changes to make things better. And to not do this sends out a message, a ripple of apathy which trickles down and says these things aren't important. The other thing, I suppose, is that of the environment. The report stresses that educators must model appropriate behaviours. Well, I don't know any professionals that model sexually inappropriate behaviours at all, actually. And I wonder whether we need to take a step right back to the beginning and to look at language. And I'm thinking maybe about gendered language. So in this review, 92% of girls reported experiencing sexualized abusive language. And there's often a power imbalance here as well. But people don't just start using this language. It grows out of an environment where everyday gendered language becomes acceptable. And the BBC published an article on this last year. It's called Subtle Ways That Language Shapes Us, and you can Google that if you're interested. But it talks about the world historically being prescribed with a male gender default, and that male bias is embedded in our psyches, and it sets a power imbalance early on, and then inequality starts, and then there becomes a gap for abuse to move in. And so sayings that some people might think are harmless, like you need to go and man the decks, well, maybe they're not quite so harmless after all. So I suppose this isn't really a question so much as a musing or a wondering out loud, but I just wondered what either of you might think.
I'll come in on that, because again, it's something that I'm very involved with. I think it also links so much with what Melissa was saying about what our schools are seen to be there for, you know, about the narrow curriculum, around, you know, the facts, about getting kids through exams and everything else. There's no space in the curriculum for the sort of discussions and thinking and work with kids to help them to explore what is going on with this and to learn about it. You know, I think, I don't know if it's changed, because I've not worked in a school now for a year or two, but I mean, I think even the requirement for sex education had gone. And I know, you know, this comprehensive that I was working in, they just didn't have any. They didn't have anything, you know, no sexual education, no relationship work. It was really, really difficult, you know, because you heard this, you know, the teachers were very aware of, particularly, you know, the social pressures, the peer group pressures, you know, the stuff about the, you know, what kids were having to post online, what was going on. But it was really difficult to sort of deal with it, except by trying to handle each individual case. And that's not the way it needs to go. You know, what we need to be doing is sort of seeing our schools as being an opportunity to help our children across the whole of their emotional and social development. It isn't just about facts and passing exams. And the other thing that I think is really important as well is actually to see schools as communities. And in that community, as you say, every member of staff, you know, is part of that community. And if we're looking at the well-being of children, we need to be looking at well-being of teachers, who are, I think, in the top 3 of the most stressed and suffering, you know, professional groups that there is, you know, because what is happening to teachers as a result, you know, it's the whole macro system down to the micro system. You know, teachers are under intolerable pressures, you know, working as you're having to do, and then it inevitably comes down to sort of relationships that you're able to have with the children. And that sort of that sense of schools as being part of the community has also been broken apart by sort of academies and kids going out of their areas and all of that sort of stuff. It's just, well, like Melissa said, you know, if you wanted to try and come up with a prescription for a dysfunctional system that was doing more harm than good, well, this is what you'd come up with for education, isn't it? You know, from age 3 or 4, when you're expected to sit at a desk. Sorry, I mean, this is going off your point, but you know, it's just
not actually, and it's linked to my last question, and I've got some names to put other people in, but my last question was actually about teacher well-being, because I don't think that we can sit here and talk about child well-being without talking about colleague well-being, because workloads are huge. Teachers in all sectors, schools, colleges and universities, working 60+ hours a week, planning, preparing, marking, actually delivering sessions, the duplication of data from system to system to system, jumping from task to task to task and back again, performance management processes that break people, teaching observations that degrade and demotivate, comment and critique that challenges not only what you do as an educator, but the values underpinning your work and your integrity. And the challenge runs deep because this becomes about who you are as a human being. And of course, the lack of pay awards, teachers knowingly undervalued. So children, teenagers, young people are highly sensitive to their environments, and they will pick up on the stress and distress of their teachers. Zimbardo, the psychologist, the prison experiments guy, he says that our environments shape and influence our behaviours. So really then, the last question I'm going to ask you is, what are the long-term consequences for our young people of not investing in our educators?
I think a disaster, actually. I think, yeah, but again, you've given important information there. I think a statistic, again, from before the pandemic, and I can qualify it in one regard in a minute, but 40% of teachers had left within 5 years. That's a huge number. Now, that's changed because anxiety about employment meant that that people are going into teaching because it's an area where they're recruiting, but that doesn't mean the same problems aren't going to arise. But what we are seeing is that heads are now quitting because the burdens of leadership are such, and the pandemic. I've talked to lots of heads during the last year, and in many ways they've said it's been an amazing period where parents have understood the role of a school in a community because the community has come to the fore during COVID. But then they have had the DFE bombarding them, because remember, we have a centralised system really. We don't really have school autonomy. We have the DFE bombarding them with information, and so heads are really at the end of their tether now. But I just think it's back to, we've got everything the wrong way around. Teachers have no autonomy. That's the real problem. I mean, I think a pay freeze, which I think in effect is what we have, is wrong, but it's particularly wrong when you think that some heads of schools, like the head of my old school, I'm afraid to say, a single academy, earns twice what the Prime Minister earns. The head of the Harris Federation, a group of schools, takes home a package of over, with benefits and as well as just his salary, of over $500,000 a year. That's what the freeing up of the school system has allowed. And I think all these things feed into not good relations, and they're all things that students pick up. And if you're being taught by a teacher who's being controlled themselves by a curriculum and a leadership and suppressed, that's going to affect our children. You know, I think it's too easy to do what I'm about to do now, but I have to bring it in. You know, I think we can look at systems that do it differently, of which Finland is a very good example. Finland has had a lot of challenges, but it's evolving and adapting. All school systems have to evolve and adapt, but they have a completely different approach to special needs, to teacher training. You have to be up. You know, we also have teacher training that's like a fast food. You do it in 6 weeks in some cases, and then you go into a classroom. I think it should take time. You should only select select the most thoughtful, well-qualified people. I think it should take time to be trained. I think it should be an investment in a lifelong vocation. And I think you should be given freedom once you get in the classroom, and you should be paid well, and classes should be smaller. There's all sorts of things, and we keep making the same mistakes and paying for them down the line.
Julia, did you want to come in on that finally? And then I'm going to go to Joyce for her question.
I think just to totally agree, really, with what Melissa is saying there. You know, the impact, the personal impact for school staff, you know, in terms of just, you know, their lives and what they can do outside of their working life. You know, you don't have that many free hours, and not much time for your own children, and the thing, you know, it's huge, the impact on the adults. But we are also seeing this, you know, increasing rate of child adolescent mental health problems. And we also know, you know, that the majority of mental health problems start in childhood and early-ish adolescence. So, you know, they don't just grow out of it like people used to think. You know, this is going to carry on unless something is done about it. And actually the things that you know, you were talking about sort of the sexual issues, particularly for girls in schools. And actually it's it's the girls and it's the women who are actually having the highest levels of these sorts of, you know, these difficulties because of the sort of pressures that are operating on them from these early days. In child services, a lot of what you see up to age about 10 is boys. You see far more of them because you've got more boys tend to have that sort of more developmental difficulties, you know, that you might see as being sort of like ADHD things or other sorts of, you know, emotional maturity problems and all of that sort of thing. You hit secondary school and the numbers of girls coming into services just sort of rockets, and so it carries on. And that is so much about, you know, the sort of the patriarchal society, but the pressures that are operating on them in, you know, in school, and that sexual pressures that have always been there, you know, the harassment, the comments, but actually I think it is far worse now than, you know, for teenage girls than it used to be. Whereas it ought to be the opposite after all we've learned. That's probably all I can add.